So it is 6 o'clock. I am so excited to have Gilbert King and Paul Perkins Jr. and Harold Pryor and Jim Bartemus with us tonight to discuss Gilbert's important and really just amazing book, Devil in the Grove. Please send us your questions in the comment section. We may be able to get people on screen too to ask questions. I hope we will, but as soon as you think of a question, please put it into the chat. You have this incredible opportunity to get answers from Mr. King and Mr. Perkins too. So put your questions in as soon as you think of them. We've got two links. Actually, before we get to all that, we're going to bring on our bartender. We've been doing it at the beginning, and a lot of people seem to like that, so they can have a drink if they'd like during our discussion. We've got a link in the chat to the recipe for the drink for those of you who are following along and making it. And we also have a link to put your name in for some cool literary prizes, and we'll announce the winners at the end. We'll do some type of drawing. But in the meantime, our normal bartender, Mac, is not with us. This time we have his partner, Destiny, who I think works in the same bar on Manhattan with Mac. We're bringing him on now. And remember, guys, when you get brought on screen, there's usually a brief moment when you go blank and then you get brought on. So Destiny, you work with Mac?
Hello, yes, I've worked with Mac for the past 7 years. We were both at the Whaling together, and right now we're in our third week of our new bar, Bandits, on West Village. We opened together.
Really? All right. Well. So next time anyone's in New York City, the bar is called Bandits?
Yes, indeed.
All right. All right. So, and we're bringing on a couple more panelists, a couple more people who have volunteered to make this drink with you. You've got 4 minutes to teach them how to make this drink. I think even Mr. Perkins is going to be one of them, which is exciting. One of our panelists is making the drink. So go ahead, take it away, Destiny.
You got it. First off, how's my sound coming in? Does everyone hear me?
Yep, it's good.
Yes, excellent. So first off, we're going to make the classic Planter's Punch. It's a classic rum cocktail. We'll be needing rum, simple syrup, lime juice, grenadine, Angostura bitters, and we're going to flourish it off with a mint sprig as a garnish. Now, first, we're going to add 3/4 of an ounce of lime juice. If you have a proper bartender's jigger like I do, that's great. If not, you can use a tablespoon measure, a shot glass, anything that will allow for consistency amongst your many different ingredients. First off is 3/4 of an ounce of lime juice. Next is 1 ounce simple syrup. Simple syrup is very simple. It's just water and sugar mixed together. And that will help us bring balance to the citrus and the viscosity of the sugar. Next is a bar schooner teaspoon of grenadine. Grenadine also is pomegranate syrup. So I just made mine at home. We'll dump in there and we're good to go. And then 3 dashes Angostura bitters, classic aromatic bitters. You'll notice that you get it at any grocery store with a yellow cap. Now, when dashing, don't be bashful. Throw it in there. 1, 2, 3. And you got it. Next, and definitely not least, our rum. I'm using Mount Bay rum myself. We're going to go 3 ounces because this is a punch. And so because we have so much citrus and other ingredients, we can add more than the classic 2 ounces of alcohol to it. And now we're going to take our shaker, fill it all the way to the top with our ice. If you have a 2-piece shaker, if you have the 3-piece shaker that has the little cap on top, fill it about 2/3 of the way up. Is everyone with me? Yes? No? Feel free to speak up. And now when we shake, I hope Mac went over this. When you shake, you want to think of the ice not moving in a straight line back and forth, but moving centripetally in a circle so that you get what we like to call aeration. And really, that's just a scientific word for getting air bubbles between the liquid molecules. And that makes it classic a cocktail frothy. And here we go. And you know you're done with your shake when you get a little bit of frost on the outside of your tin or your fingers start to stick to it. That's when you know you're done. And beautiful Planters Punch cocktail. I'm going to fill up my glass with ice here. And then strain the punch inside. And we're about to show you a little trick, bartender's trick, to make sure our soda water that we're putting on top includes all the flavors. We're going to put that into our shaker tin. Just a splash. Give it a little swirl and pour it on top. Finishing off with a lovely mint sprig. You want to help that mint flavor, that aroma express. Give it a couple of slaps to the back of your hand. And there we go. Your Planter's Punch.
Thank you, Destiny.
Of course.
That's great. I actually learned a lot. I have a confession. I made mine before we started just to be safe, but
excellent.
It was better. Now I wish I had made it. I learned a lot.
It's excellent. And now we also have a non-alcoholic version. If we have time, we can include that. Is everyone ready?
Yeah, please.
All right. Now for this one, we're going to need orange juice, 2 ounces, or 2 shot glasses full. We're going to do 2 ounces again of lemonade to help balance that off. And grenadine, 1 ounce, bringing balance to our flavors of citrus and sweetness. And we're going to shake it up also with ice. Pour some into our glass. Again, shaking centrifugally. Here we go. A little quick frothy shake. We call that a whip shake in the business. Pour it out. And once again, add a little ginger ale on top. I do love ginger. Into your tin, give it a little swirl so the flavors can acclimate to one another. And then we're going to garnish with some maraschino cherries. And here we have our virgin Planter's Punch.
Beautiful. Thank you.
My pleasure.
We've actually got a question, Destiny. Maybe you can email this so we can give it out to the participants. But can you give us your recipe for the home pomegranate grenadine?
Oh, yes, it's very simple. You just take equal parts sugar to pomegranate juice. I bought some pomegranate juice, equal 1 part to 1 part. I did a 1/4 cup. Give it a stir till all the sugar dilutes, and now you have grenadine.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Maybe we'll see you in a month or 2.
Hopefully. Have a great day. Enjoy the seminar.
All right. Thank you.
You got it.
All right. So you guys saw one of the people making drinks was Mr. Perkins. He'll be back on in a little because he's on our panel. But first, we're going to bring on the man of the hour, our author, Gilbert King. And I'm going to take a little bit to introduce him before we bring on the other panelists and introduce them. Mr. King is from Brooklyn, New York. He won the Pulitzer Prize, or he lives in Brooklyn, New York now. He's won the Pulitzer Prize for this book, Devil in the Grove, which was also a New York Times bestseller. He's written about race, civil rights, and the death penalty for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic. And you can read more about him if you want. His biography is very impressive. But I want to say one more thing about Mr. King that you won't find in his biography. But one of my heroes is Thurgood Marshall, not only because he sacrificed and struggled fighting a just fight, the good fight, but also because he won. You know, I want you to think for a moment about those trials in Tennessee that Gilbert King told us about in Devil in the Grove, with people outside the courthouse getting violent. But inside the courthouse, Thurgood Marshall was getting acquittals. And the people inside the courthouse, the jurors, were just like the people outside the courthouse. They were the same way of thinking. But Marshall was convincing them. He opened them up to the truth so they could hear it. And that's one of the most difficult things in the world. But if you read The Devil in the Grove, you can see that Gilbert King has that same magic. You know, he really has opened up people to the truth. I really mean that, Gilbert. But I hope you all read, before we let him talk, I hope you all read in the appendix, if you had the version that had the appendix in it, which was some of the letters that were written after the first edition came out. And I just want to take a minute to read a little bit, a couple of excerpts from that. Somebody wrote, I started my read prepared to defend and preserve my wonderful memories of time spent in the groves surrounding my grandparents' house in Leesburg, Florida. For a while, I was mad at you. Your book changed what I thought of my childhood. I am not mad at you anymore. You have opened my eyes in a way that a man needs his eyes opened. I mean, wow, just think about that. So in my mind, Mr. King, you're a hero too. And I know you're going to start with some general comments. We'd love to hear from you. And then I'll ask you some questions and we'll bring on the other panelists. But go ahead and please tell us what you know, so we start with some general comments.
Thanks, John, and thanks for those kind words. And I actually really love the fact that you read that letter, because that meant a lot to me. I remember when I received that letter. He was a man who grew up in Lake County, and like his family like knew about the case, and he didn't know anything. And he ended up going on to law school, became a lawyer. He now works in Alabama. But you know, that letter meant a lot to me, and I sort of became friendly with him and talked to him and started working on a new book. And his father became one of my great sources. He was still working in the citrus groves in Lake County, and you know, he understood that how to manage groves and the picking, and he became a really valuable source for me because I was going back to that same area. So I really thank you for me, because that letter, when I first received it, meant a lot to me. I felt like I wanted to share that with readers, and I managed to get it into the paperback version. So
yeah, thank you so much for doing that. I mean, it gives me chills to read it, and you know, I can only imagine how it affected you.
Yeah, it really did, especially the part where he said, you know, I was mad at you, and then I realized that, you know, once I learned more, I'm not mad at you anymore. And it really did mean a lot to me. And I did receive letters from people who were from Lake County who tell me these stories about, like, I had no idea this was happening in my backyard, and I feel so ignorant to history. And so it really did open my eyes too, to get that kind of reaction. But you know, I was thinking I could build off what you just said about Thurgood Marshall and winning cases, and it certainly is true. The Columbia, Tennessee, which I start the book out with, you know, that was a case where he didn't even expect to win. He thought he was going to lose that case, and all of a sudden he sees acquittal after acquittal. It kind of puzzled him, because one of the things he said, like when he went down into the South to do these death penalty cases, he said there was no way I'm going to win here in these antebellum courthouses with 12 white jurors from the South, you know, talking about, you know, racial cases, death penalty cases. It was a really difficult thing for him to do, and I kept thinking about, like, you know, we've all read like To Kill a Mockingbird, or at least seen the movie. We're familiar with, you know, Atticus Finch and this trial progressing, and at this moment, he calls Mayella Ewell to the stand, and he starts to question her, and he starts to get to the truth through his cross-examination. It's a very, you know, sort of a moving part of that story. And if you look at like the Groveland story, like Thurgood Marshall was told, there's no way that an African-American lawyer could stand up in court and question the word of a white woman. That will be the surest way to inflame the jury and send your, you know, defendants to the electric chair. And so what Marshall was told is, you have to hire a white lawyer, a local white lawyer, to do those cross-examinations. And I remember reading that thinking, where's my like To Kill a Mockingbird moment? Like, it's just not there, because this is real life. This is, you know, this is not fiction. And so that was what Marshall was really concerned about, inflaming that jury and just getting an automatic death sentence. And so, you know, Marshall would say, like, I expect to lose in these kind of cases where I'm going down and taking these, you know, death penalty cases in the Jim Crow South. I expect to lose them, but I also expect to gather enough material to take it to an appellate court. And I will probably lose in the appellate court, but once I get to the Supreme Court, that's my level playing field. And he said, that's where I feel like our issues can actually be considered in a more fair and unbiased manner. And he was right. If you look at his Supreme Court record, I think he was like 32-3 personally. And I was just curious. I looked at the 3 cases he lost. He never should have lost those cases. Like he was right, except the justices for political reasons, like felt that they should switch their opinions on this. And, so he really should have won those cases too. But in the local cases, the state, those were the really difficult cases because he realized he had to get them to the appellate level. So I think that was one of the most striking things, is just looking at, To Kill a Mockingbird, to look for these cinematic moments, and you're doing research and you're looking at those moments thinking, well, where's this dramatic moment in the court? They just come from different areas. They're not based on like cross examinations. One of the things I think that was really fascinating to me is just reading these transcripts from these trials, and beginning with the voir dire process, where they're questioning potential jurors, and the lawyers have to ask, like, how would you feel if you saw a black man standing up there arguing law with a white person? And that was a real question they had to ask and get answers from potential jurors, and you could see the confusion. Like, the jurors were like, well, aren't those the defendants? Like, they didn't realize who was sitting at the table. And it had to be explained to them, and no, they're actually African American lawyers. I mean, most of the people who would come into that courtroom were, if you were black, you were a defendant. So you were never seeing African Americans in the courthouse. It was such a strange thing for the jurors to see. And so when you go through that, you see that those kind of things happen. The state attorney first meeting Thurgood Marshall and his lawyers, and he's like, what are the defendants doing? Where are your lawyers? And he doesn't even understand. Like, it's just so strange to them. And these are the kind of, I mean, we call them microaggressions today, I guess, but like, those are the kind of things that Marshall and his lawyers dealt with constantly. And those are the small things. The big things were, of course, like being chased out of town by the Klan, like that. Those were, I wouldn't consider those microaggressions. Those were macroaggressions, right? And so that was the environment, like, and to go down to, like, in this case, the Groveland case, and like recognizing that, like, oh, we're going to check into one of the only African-American hotels and go straight in the entrance and straight out the back and get in a car and be moved to a safe house, because if people found out you're staying at the hotel, now it's dangerous. And so, like, this story is just constantly like putting forth this aura of danger, where the lawyers are being threatened at every turn. The Klan is driving around their hotels and with crosses and burning torches and expecting to go to court the next morning. I mean, the level of danger. And I think that was one of the things that was the most striking in this case. And Marshall, there was a really interesting interview that I saw, like, in his later years, and the interviewer said, weren't you scared? You're going down there, and meeting with local officials and trying to investigate these cases. And Marshall's answer was like, hell yeah, I'm scared. These guys are trying to kill me. It was a very dangerous thing. But he goes, but from my perspective, I could get on a train and go back to New York and live in safe and comfort. The heroes are the people like, Paul Perkins, who, he was one of the lawyers that was working with Thurgood Marshall. He had to stay down there and continue to investigate and continue to work on these cases. They were the real heroes, he said. These are the people that were putting their lives in danger and in jeopardy to take on these cases. So Paul Perkins, young lawyer, opportunities to work with Thurgood Marshall. Of course, he took it. He was investigating this, and he was going out through Lake County, and it was extraordinarily dangerous. And, he constantly being threatened. Harry T. Moore was working with Thurgood Marshall. He wasn't a lawyer, but he was, basically tasked by Marshall to keep media pressure and keep political pressure on Sheriff Willis McCall. And, in between trials, the Ku Klux Klan puts a bomb under his house, killing both him and his wife. This case caused the death of 5 people. It was extraordinarily dangerous. And I sometimes think about that. We often look at, like, the Scottsboro Boy case. Scottsboro Boys in 1931 in Alabama. Well, most people are aware of that. It was a Broadway play. It was a story that sort of represented, civil rights and injustice in the early part of the 20th century. But that the sheriff wasn't killing the defendants, executing the defendants, and taking the law into his own hands. And so I think it really speaks to, like, Florida being, I write about this in the book, calling it South of the South. It was just off the radar. People didn't look at Florida and think, well, that's the South, that's the Cotton Belt South. It was happening below, like Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia. Things that happened in Florida were kind of confusing to people. They had, later on, a fairly progressive governor. It was Miami. It was an international city. Like, people didn't look at Florida as the South. So you had these atrocities, cases like the Groveland story, there's another case that's just absolutely very similar to the Emmett Till case. Teenager being lynched by town officials because he wrote a Christmas card to a white drugstore clerk. Nobody knows about this case. This predates Emmett Till by 10 years. And Thurgood Marshall worked on this with Harry T. Moore, and they got nowhere with it. They couldn't get an investigation, and they had witnesses who said, could identify the name of the people who murdered this kid, and it just wasn't good enough. And so that was the kind of frustration that Marshall and his staff, LDF lawyers, and would have to deal with constantly. And it was just, one of the things that they complained about was, like, as the legal defense fund, they couldn't prosecute cases. They couldn't force prosecution. They could defend people, but when it came to prosecution, they would just basically have to tell people, and it was heartbreaking. You have to write to your local officials, write to the churches, get involved and apply pressure. And this is your best hope. But, like, you could imagine so many of these cases just falling off the wayside. And I like to think that the Groveland case, really, the only reason we know about it today is because Sheriff Willis McCall shot two of the defendants on the side of the road, and one of them survived. And that his survival and being able to tell the story of what happened to him became kind of like the cell phone camera footage from the 1951, right? So this was they were able to uncover a bullet that had been fired straight through the neck of Walter Irvin that they found in the soil, that really disputed Willis McCall's testimony of what happened and supported Walter Irvin's. And so the FBI was livid. They saw this, they wrote up a report, they recommended charging the sheriff with first-degree murder and attempted murder, and it just got quashed at the local level. And ultimately, that's, like, one of the most disturbing parts of this case is that you had the U.S. attorney in Tampa, who was a avowed segregationist, older gentleman. There was no value in him for prosecuting civil rights cases. There was no political value whatsoever. And so basically what they did was just quash these. And one of the FBI agents in his report was talking about this case getting quashed, the investigation into whether Willis McCall shot the prisoners. And he said, he was told that the case was quashed for 4 words: tranquility of the South. In other words, if people really knew it was happening, they might riot in the streets. And so all of this, when I filed the Freedom of Information Act request, I was the first person to unseal these records. They hadn't been opened before. So I'm reading these things, and I'm seeing things that even the defense counsel had never seen. And later on, I went to see Jack Greenberg, who was still alive when I started writing this book, one of Thurgood Marshall's young assistants. And he was like, "Oh, we never saw this." I showed him the material. He goes, "We never saw this. We assumed it, but we could never prove it. We could never question it. We couldn't go there." And I could imagine just the way the criminal justice system was stacked in the favor of the state back then. I mean, it's obviously stacked today, but back then, you couldn't get anything. Every time they tried to subpoena something, they were told still under investigation, can't release the files. It was just a nightmarish thing. And if you look at that, those trials, there's prosecutorial misconduct at every turn. I mean, at one point, the prosecutor, Jesse Hunter, is going up against Thurgood Marshall in the closing argument. And, he's recognized, wow, I'm up against this Mr. Civil Rights. He leans onto the rail and addresses the 12 white jurors. And he says, "Gentlemen of the jury, I regret to have to tell you this, but I'm stricken with a fatal disease. This may be my last case. I don't want to go out with a loss." I mean, and Marshall, they're just covering, they're like, they can't, every single objection is just, overruled. So they don't even bother anymore. They're just collecting this information. And so when I'm reading this, like, I'm not even a lawyer. I'm looking at this going, you can't do that, and it's just done at every turn. So that was like the main thing. I mean, he did win at the higher levels, but like in the locally, he was often up against, like, just get it to the appellate level. Hopefully we'll get it to the Supreme Court. Just can't win locally for the most part.
Yeah, but he was convincing people. He did get some acquittals and even or recommendations for mercy, or even people outside the courthouse. And I want to talk a little bit later about the effect he had on some of the people, but I want to bring in the panelists for that. Before we get to that, I have a couple of questions for you, just mainly on the writing of the book.
Sure.
But let me just say one thing, just to make sure I don't forget. it's important to remember when we talk later about Paul Perkins Sr., you know, it was not clear when he got involved in those cases that he would survive, right? We know he did, but you look at Harry Moore and even more like Shepard's dad, you know, he's a broken man at the end, this guy who drained the swamp himself and built a living and had his son fought in the war, and then he came back and built a life, and then they just all smashed him. So there were a lot of people who fell, you know. We can't just look at Marshall, who survived, and Perkins. But anyway, so I'm curious, you said, you know, what you were looking for, these cinematic moments. It's so fascinating to me because I first read the book a few years back, and I was just going to read my notes. I always take really detailed notes to get ready. But once I started, I no, I got to start over and read it again. And one thing that struck me was how hard it was to write this book. I mean, you put together so many, you found your cinematic moments, but in the strangest places.
Yes.
You had to bring in other cases. You had to bring in more general things. You ended the book. I don't understand why it was so emotional to me, but both times when I read the ending with Norma having signed the appeal for clemency, it just emotionally affected me. So I guess, can you tell us a little more about your process? I mean, it's incredible to me that you could take these things and make a book that so many people have called, they say it reads like a thriller.
Right.
And when you started, it was the furthest thing from that.
That's a really good point. And I think like one of the things is like I started and I was learning as I went. So I'm like trying to read everything and trying to and absorb all this thing. And you know, these books take me 5 years. And so like one of the things I was reading, like, well, this is Marshall, and he lost these two cases and they're very similar before. What did he do differently? Like what, and how did he evolve? And so I felt like a lot of these extemporaneous cases kind of, they might seem abstract, but when you get to the end, you can sort of see what he learned from some of his earlier losses and his earlier, you know, where he just lost people, really, like defendants. And here's a really perfect example of that. At one point towards the end, Thurgood Marshall is, you know, about to start the second trial. And now this case has now gotten like international coverage. And it's an embarrassment to the state of Florida because they're like, we want tourism down here. We want people buying oranges. And, you know, like now there's boycotts on oranges. There's boycotts on tourism. It was an embarrassment to Governor Collins to have to, you know, have this Wild West in the middle part of Florida. And so like you see the resistance to this, and the state of Florida is trying to, you know, be, I guess, more modernized, and these are the kind of things that are happening in Florida, and Marshall is just determined to like go through with this trial. But then he gets a message from an envoy from the governor saying, look, the governor wants this case over with. He doesn't want any more publicity on this case. Here's a plea, you know, get Walter Irvin to plead guilty. We'll give him life in prison. We won't send him to the electric chair. And then when this dies down, we can work on getting him out. And that was the message that the envoy delivered to Marshall. And I thought Marshall's going to be, no way, we're going to trial. His response was totally different. His was like, Walter, take this deal. The state of Florida is going to kill you. Let's just delay this. And it was really based on, like, right before this trial, he was involved in a case in Virginia. It's called the Martinsville 7. And it's a very similar case, you know, 7 African-Americans, young African-Americans accused of sexual assault of a white woman. And they got involved in the appeal and they lost. And so one after another, every 15 minutes, those defendants were marched to the electric chair in Virginia. And so he's fresh off this case, and all he is doing is standing, you know, hugging the mothers, saying, I'm sorry, I tried my best. And like that really affected him. And so now when he has a chance from the governor to save a life, he's like, take it, we'll come back and fix this later. But Walter Irvin refuses to take the plea. He just says, I will not lie about this case. And so he refuses, and Marshall's like, they're going to kill you. And he's like, I got the great Thurgood Marshall defending me. He just won in the Supreme Court. And Marshall's like, this ain't the Supreme Court. You know? And there's no guarantee you're going to get to the Supreme Court again. And that's the really difficult thing. Like, he didn't want to take a chance, and he got criticized from his own colleagues. Like, no, you take this case to the end. You don't take any pleas. But Marshall was much more of a realist. He's like, save a life. We can fix it later. We can try. Don't let this man get killed. And so I thought, those are cinematic moments in themselves, but they come from really, as you said, unexpected places.
But even when you found those through, I imagine, exhaustive research, did you have in mind a structure of how you were going to write, what the structure of the book was? How did it come about the way it did?
That's a really good question, and I didn't like it. Sort of because of the way that unfolded. Like, if you were writing a novel, you definitely wouldn't have two trials, right? Because like you'd want to have the. It's not what I had here. I have two trials. But what's fascinating is after the first trial, you have the sheriff trying to assassinate the defendants, and then you have the Klan killing Thurgood Marshall, basically his right-hand man, and Harry T. Moore. So there's nothing more dramatic than that, than like setting it, well, there's going to be a retrial, and like maybe this will be the case where justice, and no, it's not. It leads to more murder and more mayhem. So in a way, real life just made the story much darker than it normally would be if you were writing a novel and you wanted this to play out along normal structures. And so I had to deal with that a lot. I had to deal with the fact that, Walter Irvin, once again, the second time, gets convicted and sentenced to death. Where's the justice? Where's the victory? I mean, the victory is sort of outside the courtroom. And you talked about this a little bit earlier, but like organizing boycotts, putting political pressure on the governor, making sure that everyone's aware of this, using the media, using the power of celebrity, using religious groups to sort of put pressure from all these different, like a different pronged attack. And that's the thing we think about Thurgood Marshall. We think all of his accomplishments were done in the courtroom. The truth of the matter is, a lot of the times he had to go outside the courtroom to get justice, political pressure, anything he could think of. And so that was the thing that was really surprising to me, because my vision of Thurgood Marshall was not that he was, an activist on the outside. I thought everything he gained was in the courtroom, but he knew that the courts could only go so far. Sometimes you had to go in different directions.
All right, so we have some questions from people. Several of the questions I'm going to save till we bring the panel on. In fact, Roland, why don't we start bringing the panel on, because that takes a minute, and I'll introduce them once they all get on. But until then, and that's Harold Pryor, Paul Perkins Jr., and Jim Bartimus, Roland. But while that's happening, let me ask you one of the questions from our attendees. When and how did you first learn of the Groveland case?
Oh yeah, that's a really interesting question, because I was working on a case that was based in Louisiana, and some other lawyers were representing a young African American by the name of Willie Francis, who was 16 years old, sent to the electric chair, a traveling electric chair that was brought from parish to parish, hooked up in the jail. They'd execute a prisoner, move on to the next parish. That was the way it worked back then. And Marshall was advising them. It was 1946. I'm like, what is Thurgood Marshall doing advising these two white lawyers in Louisiana about how to save, the life of a young man? Because these young lawyers didn't want Thurgood Marshall, the NAACP, involved. They thought that would be a negative thing. They thought should be better handled by locals. And it was a disaster. They had no experience, and they ended up going to the US Supreme Court, and they kind of failed in their argument. And Marshall was trying to advise them the whole way. And I remember thinking, as I was researching that, what else was Thurgood Marshall doing? Like, why is he involving the lawyers, advising them on death penalty cases? And so I said, when I get back to the East Coast, I'm going to go into Washington, D.C. and look through his personal files and look at some of these cases that he was involved in, because I'd never heard of them before. And then I found this case that took place in Groveland, and it hadn't really been written about that much. And I was kind of surprised it wasn't showing up in his biographies. And, we think of Thurgood Marshall as someone who, was first African-American Supreme Court justice. We think of him as like, well, yes, he was with the NAACP, he did all these landmark civil rights cases, but we don't really think of him doing like death penalty cases and being out there on the front lines of these kind of cases. And that's what most interested me as a writer. Like, I was more interested in the criminal side of it. And so I started looking at this Groveland case, and I just couldn't believe what I was reading. And I couldn't believe that I'd never heard of this before. And so I started doing some more investigation on it, and started filing Freedom of Information Act requests. And one of the things that was the most dramatic to me was, like, I found a letter that had been sent by the young lawyers in Florida to Marshall up in New York. and it was written on, by pen on like hotel stationery. And it said, Thurgood, we need help. This is the most dangerous case we've ever been involved in. We're being threatened constantly. We need reinforcements. And I remember reading this going, what the hell is happening in Florida that's causing this? And that's when I started to look into the case and realizing that, wow, this isn't even showing up in Marshall's like biographies. I'm just so surprised that I haven't heard of it. But that's how I learned of it.
Well, I'm glad you did. I grew up, embarrassingly close to where all this happened, and I didn't know about it. All right, let me introduce our other panelists. Harold Pryor, he's been on some of our past book clubs. He's been nice enough to attend as a personal favor to me, no matter how busy he is. I know him personally because I worked with him briefly at Kelly Uustal, but he left us to become the first African-American man elected state attorney in Florida. So he's got a much, much, much more important job now. One of Jim Bartimus, one of the best lawyers, in the world, and one of the kindest people too, from Kansas City. I could go on for a long time about Jim, and I have at past book clubs, but I think most everyone knows him now and how amazing he is. And then we have Paul Perkins Jr. He's a great lawyer in Florida. He's here in Florida, big multi-million-dollar verdicts. He started out representing insurance companies, but then he saw the light and switched sides a long time ago. And he's only represented real people for a long time. Some interesting things. His grandfather won a case in the Florida Supreme Court in 1915 that allowed African Americans to serve on juries. His father, of course, was Paul Perkins Sr., who we read about in the book. At the time, I guess he was just Paul Perkins. But now he's Paul Perkins Sr. We talked about this a little bit already, but a lawyer with real courage, risked his own physical safety, really his life, without a doubt. He risked his life for his clients and to make a difference in the world. So Paul, let me just start with you. I want to read something, what Gilbert wrote about your dad, and then maybe you can tell us a little bit about him and maybe if he has told you any memories of this case. But a 32-year-old Black lawyer from Orlando who had attended Howard University Law School after serving in the U.S. Army, Perkins seized on the opportunity to work with Thurgood Marshall, even at the meager $3.75 per hour the LDF could afford to pay. He'd grown up accustomed to working long hours for small pay, or more commonly among his indigent clients for ham or oranges. Deep-voiced, confident, Perkins carried himself taller and larger than his thin 5'5" frame, and he shared none of Franklin Williams' compunctions about driving deep into Lake County. On his trips into Groveland, however, he would take along with him a friend's young son because supposedly some strange code of ethics prevented the Ku Klux Klan from accosting a Black man in the company of his children. There's so much alien about this book, this world, but that's one of the things that just like, what? But anyway, Paul, welcome, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about your dad.
Hey, thanks, John. So that last little tidbit is interesting because I met Gilbert. There was a guy named Gary Corsair who wrote a book about the Groveland Four before, and he got a lot of information from my mom, my dad's personal papers. And Gary gave me Gilbert's number. So I text Gilbert, and Gilbert was in Orlando. He met me at the airport, and we went and we had drinks at the bar at the airport, and we just talked for a couple of hours. And it was the first, and I was like, this is a guy who wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, and he's meeting me at the airport. It just shows you what type of guy Gilbert is. So we're there. We're
Paul,
talking.
I'm back at that airport again.
You know, so I don't see your drink though. Where's your Flanders punch? You could have ordered one. Okay, there you go. So we're talking at this meeting we have, and he says, "Hey, this story about the whole this code of ethics with the Klan." I said, "That's not true. That can't be true. They didn't have any Klan code of ethics." I said, "Listen, that's not. My dad didn't tell me that story. The kid, guy named Donald Everett, who's one of my best friend's uncle, is the one who told me that story." So then months later, Gilbert comes to Orlando and he's giving a talk on this, and Donald Everett is there. right? So I get Gilbert off the stage. I'm walking around, I go, this is the guy that rode with my dad on the, and they talked for a minute. He's like, yeah, I can't believe it. Well, yeah, that was true. They wouldn't, apparently, they wouldn't, if you had a small child with you, they wouldn't bother you. My dad's, and so imagine the parents of this kid, who was 8 or 10 years old at the time, that agreed to chaperone my dad, to go to Lake County, to fight the Klan. It's a crazy thing, yeah. But it shows how the whole community had to get behind these things.
Yeah.
And when Thurgood Marshall came to town, and Gilbert can tell stories about everywhere in the South. I mean, he was famous amongst all African Americans, especially African Americans who were professionals and that whole deal. He came to town. He stayed in their homes, and he was he was a superstar. He stayed in the home that I grew up in when he was down in Central Florida on these cases. I live in Orlando, and Orlando, for those of you who don't know, is about 55 miles or so from Lake County, where all this was going on. So yeah, it was the stories when I used to ask my dad, because he would tell this story, and this was when nobody knew anything about this case at all, and he would tell us these stories about it, and we'd ask, what was Thurgood Marshall like, and he was hilarious. That was the first thing he said was, the guy was hilarious. He would, the way they dealt with all this stress was humor, and they'd ride down, they'd be heading to the courthouse, and Thurgood would point at this big majestic oak, and he'd say, that's the one they're going to hang me on. That is an oak tree that is, that I deserve, and then he'd point to a shrub. My dad was a little guy, and he'd go, that's enough for you there, Perk. You could, they'll hang you on that one, and he was just, that's the way he dealt with it. They were, and he was an unbelievable lawyer, just phenomenal. And the whole thing about building the record, that was what they were doing. And because like Gilbert said, they didn't expect to win these cases at the state level, or the local level. They knew they had to build the record to get a justiciable issue for the federal courts and go that route, and they did that. There's another book. This is called Simple Justice, which is about all of the cases that led up to Brown versus the Board of Education all throughout the South. And Thurgood, and their whole tactic was to build the record to get to this, to the federal courts and get to the Supreme Court. So, and they use that again, like in these criminal cases as well.
Yeah, I think Gilbert, you did a great job of showing how he had this. Thurgood Marshall had this funny, larger than life personality. You can get that even if you knew nothing else about him, and I think that's really valuable. To another lesson, not just in how great a lawyer he was, but in how to deal with hard things and make a difference. All right, so now we've got this panel. I'm going to ask you guys some hard questions, okay? I don't know who's going to be able to answer this, but I'd love to hear Gilbert's thoughts on this, but the rest of you know most of the evidence too. Harold, Jim, Paul, you might know some stuff we don't, but when I reread the book, I was looking very carefully for clues, as if it was a fictional book, like a murder mystery, and trying to pull them out. But you do show us clues throughout the book about what might have happened that night. But my question is, what do you think really happened that night? Even if you don't know for sure, even if there's some speculation, and in particular, it has to have something to do with Curtis Howard. It's too big of a coincidence, but I can't even speculate at what could explain all the different pieces of evidence we have. So anyone got any ideas on what might have really happened that night?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me once again, John. I think I'm a guest, just make me a guest lifetime panelist for this. It's a pleasure to be on here with everyone. I suspected when I read the book, I thought maybe there was a disagreement. And I think maybe she may have not one of those black gentlemen, but maybe the accuser, maybe she went away with one of the black accusers. Maybe the gentleman found out In order to save herself, she then concocted this story or lie, and then it just snowballed into what we now know. That was something I always suspected reading the book. That's where my mind immediately went. I'm curious to kind of get Mr. King's thoughts on that as well.
You know, I think that was very close to what I was thinking. I looked into it. I think the way I came away with it was sort of what Franklin Williams decided when he was investigating to try and find out what really happened. And one of the things he was struck by, he met one of the reverends who was counseling the Pagets about this, and the reverend sort of spoke to him off the record and said, you know, we talked to them about this incident, and it was kind of strange to me that they bore no like ill regard towards the defendants. It's like they didn't speak, and like he said that was strange because if they really did what she was accusing them of, they would think there'd be anger and like, but they didn't seem to feel that way. And the priest, the reverend, basically told Franklin that he thought they were lying about this. What I think really happened is that the car broke down on the side of the road. There was a fight, and this was confirmed by the family members of Norma Paget, who said that they were aware of that there had been an incident on the side of the road. And I think what happened was a fight started. Norma tried to pass whiskey, and like Willie did not want them sharing it. And so what ended up happening was after the fight, where Willie got knocked down, they waited. They got a car to get them to the gas station where Curtis Howard was, and that's where they put a story into place. And they were going to get some revenge on the two defendants. And so Willie went off with the deputy to look for them, and Norma stayed behind with Curtis Howard. And Curtis Howard drove her back to Okahumpka outside that cafe and let her off on the side of the road. And there were two witnesses who saw Curtis Howard's car there at that moment. And Curtis Howard even said, yes, I was driving that way at 6:30 in the morning. So he put himself at that scene, and they had seen Norma get out of the car. I'm positive that the story was put in place there. And then when she went into that cafe, she had to start this story like I was abducted and sexually assaulted, but she couldn't say it. She didn't say it all at once.
Oh, right, okay. She might have been having second thoughts, or
Yes.
she just didn't say it.
So
Yes.
what I remember from now, my father died when I was 18, but we talked about this case before. I can't remember if it was Sam or Walter, but one of them knew Norma. I mean, the whole reason they stop and help, right? One of them, I think it was Sam. They know Norma. You know, they've grown up. Lake County is small now. So you can imagine in 1949 how small Lake County is, and that everybody's in the same industry. There's one industry, right? It's citrus. And then everybody else, if you're not in the citrus industry, then you have your own farm. And that's it, right? And so, you know, you got a gas station or something like that, but really it's really agrarian, really rural, and one of them knew her and they stopped. And so, and she has to know them to pass a bottle to one of them. If you think about that in 1949, she's not going to pass a bottle to a strange Black man she doesn't know. It's not going to happen. She's not going to pass a bottle to someone she hasn't drunk with before, most likely. It's not going to happen, right? So they know one another. You know, she and her husband are estranged at the time. They're just trying to get back together, if you remember the story. And then he's upset by this. A fight breaks out. And then you got to think about this, 1949 in Central Florida. They can't drive her home. Two Black men can't drive her to her house.
Yeah.
It's more dangerous to drive her home. It's safer for her and for them to drop her off on the side of the road somewhere than to be seen driving her home in the middle of the night, right? So then they got to come up with a story. And I think that, you know, she gets with Willie, and then it's us versus them. And then the story's concocted. And then once you've concocted the story, you got to stick with it. And you just do. And she did it until the day she died, actually. But that's the way I understand it. That makes the most sense to me. And I think that's how it went down.
Did she do it till the day she died? Because she signed that letter.
she signed a letter about the death penalty, but I don't think it was specific clemency as it related to those guys, if I'm not mistaken.
No, but it seemed to me that there might have been some, maybe that's too positive of thinking about human beings, that there might have been an element of regret. But I have to, one thing that intrigued me, and Gilbert, it was a terrific book, hard read because of what you'd call the South of the South. For Sheriff McCall to be there for 28, 30 years is just appalling. But as I'm reading the book, and it's depressing in many, many ways, even though you're always uplifted by Thurgood Marshall, it's depressing. But yet at the very end, you put in the note from Uustal,
Yeah.
which all of a sudden made me think, wait a minute, maybe something got through. Maybe this is the little element that builds on each other, and because that was out of nowhere. And I thought it was just brilliant way to end the book, that it put you back on a positive note, that maybe things were changing.
Yeah,
So
it was quite possible that you could have left us just so depressed and morally, like with not the will to fight to make it better, just the desire to crawl up in a hole and cry.
Right.
But let me read the letter Jim's talking about, because this also, I can't explain why so many points you made it so emotional. And I actually, Jim, I almost read this at the beginning, but I got embarrassed. I don't know why. This shouldn't be, there's something strange about this, and maybe I should be embarrassed that it moved me so much. But my dear Mr. So she wrote this to Thurgood Marshall after Irvin had been killed or died in Lake County. My dear Mr. Justice, enclosed, please find clipping which I believe needs checking. I've thought of this poor man often over the years. I was shocked to read this over my morning coffee. McCall is a disgrace to the law of this wonderful country of ours. I have lived in Holly Hill, Florida for 18 years. I am Catholic, I am white, married, and have a son 16 years of age. I am proud of you. Sincerely, Mrs. Ruth N. Starr.
it was awesome.
I don't know. It got me emotionally. It's certainly a great way to end the book. I don't know what it says about me that it affected me so much though. But anyway, so Jim, I just want to make sure everyone knows what you were talking about. So go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I think it just put things on a very, to me, reading about McCall, first of all, you have this emotional dichotomy of all the uplifting things that Marshall is overcoming and doing. And then you have the business as usual and what you call the South of the South of McCall being there and at every level being exonerated and not even being questioned, which is just very disturbing. And so you have this dichotomy of emotion as you're reading this book of positive, terribly negative. And and I think I've joined in with John. I'm reading the book, and then I read the letter. And that to me was also a very emotional point of being able, the woman said, I am proud of you. Had no reason to write other than I read this over my morning coffee, and you could tell how moved she was by it, that she picks up pen and writes a Supreme Court justice. I thought it was amazing.
And I have to piggyback on that, Mr. King, Gilbert. I read the book, and my wife and people around me, they, I had watery eyes. I was crying. I cried midway through the book, and also towards the end of the book. It had some significance to me, being a young Black man. I'm a fifth generation Floridian. I grew up in Central Florida. My grandfather was actually 18 years old when it happened, Gilbert, and he lived at the time in a town a little close. I think it was Claremont at the time, and he was one of those orange pickers. And I remember him telling me the story about age 13 or 14. I think we were watching something on TV, and he said, oh, there was something worse. And I said, what? And he talked about the Groveland Four, those Groveland boys, he called them. And he told me the story of when everything happened and the fear that everyone had, because at that time, and you wrote about it in the book, but he told me, like, right when this happened, immediately when it happened, Immediately when the accusation was made against those kids, he said many people in the town of Groveland picked up in the black section of town, picked up and left, booked it. They went to Orlando, they went to neighboring Tampa, they went to Claremont, neighboring towns, Dade City, where I'm from. And he said that was a real thing. And he had friends, cousins, family members, because they didn't know what was going to happen. They expected another Rosewood. They expected another massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, because it was in the DNA, it was in the history. And I want to applaud you on that, because I think the book really touched on those heartstrings, those emotions that I think I grew up hearing, because the go to that point, people have the image of Florida, Orlando, Disney World, Miami, but some people fail to realize that in the 1920s, I believe, and I think you alluded to it in the book, Florida led the country in lynchings. And then when you look at the history of the Civil War, I believe Florida was the second or third state to actually secede from the Union before Mississippi, and I think before other states. So I think you did a great job in that book touching on that, but also touching on the orange industry, how important that was in the subjugation of Black Americans in Central Florida for the cheap and forced labor, and how they would pick up boys. My grandfather would tell me stories how he'd just be walking and the sheriff would walk up, or a sheriff's deputy, and say, "Where are you going, son?" "I'm just walking home." "Get in the car." They'd take him away, it'd be truancy, he'd be labeled a truant, and he'd have to go pick oranges and work it off. And that was a real thing that Blacks in Florida were subjugated to keep the orange industry going. And I like how you went into that, how McCall kind of played a force in that as the chief law enforcement officer in that region. That book was great in a practical sense, because I think it gave a voice to many of us that heard the oral histories from our grandparents. And it was actually, to see it on paper was an amazing thing, and it was an emotional thing for me.
You know, the worst, it was all horrible, all horrible. But Ernest Thomas had nothing to do. I mean, same with Charles Greenwood, Greenlee, but Ernest Thomas, the only reason he was involved was because McCall was involved in the Bolita business, and was, you know, in a I guess a competition with Ernest Thomas's family and his mom. And I mean, just he used it as an excuse to, I mean, there's so many tragic circumstances connected to this book. And I want to piggyback on what everyone was saying, how Gilbert brought us back at the end and gave us hope, you know, hope in, you know, in the future. And more importantly for Gilbert, hope in buying his next book. You know, I think that's what it was all about more than anything. But I'm kidding. But it just showed, you know, it is all, and it's still, you know, there are highs and lows. You know, history doesn't go this way. It goes, it's more of a wave, you know.
Well, speaking of his other books, we have a comment in the comment section that someone read Beneath a Ruthless Sun before reading Devil in the Grove. Just reiterating that Sheriff McCall was, I mean, a rare example of pretty much true evil. You know, just think about that. If the decision to implicate those two people to help the Bolita business, you know, to murder the two of them on the side of the highway. On the other hand, you know, he let's look at the world that they were in. McCall's two of his siblings were born before he was born. They were killed. His brother drowned, right? He worked picking cotton. Then look at Greenlee's family. Oh my God. The two little girls killed by trains. And then the mother just distraught with grief. And he's, I think it was 15 or 16, and he's got to leave home and make a way. And then this happens to him. I mean, I'll be honest, I cannot comprehend the world that those two people grew up in. I guess I'm spoiled or in some way, but I still feel I have the right to judge Sheriff McCall as evil. I mean, right? No matter what the circumstances of his, I don't feel like I meet many evil people in day to day. At least they don't reveal it. maybe McCall didn't, but I mean, what do you guys think about? I mean, there's no excuse. I'm not excusing the word. The James Baldwin short story. It's not excusing to understand, but McCall is beyond understanding, isn't he?
I think we got to be careful on attributing it to individuals too much, because he couldn't have done this stuff alone.
Yeah.
Look at Yates. Look at Mabel. Is it Mabel Reese? I can't remember.
Yeah.
Look at all the support he's got to have to maintain that whole thing. He could not possibly have done it alone. He could be scapegoated at the end. Like, it's easy for everybody who was involved. I mean, look at the prosecutor, everybody who's involved in making sure this goes down exactly like it's supposed to. And then when it gets the negative publicity that it deserved, everybody kind of points at the one guy, right?
Yeah.
But it's not just McCall. There's a lot of people that got to be complicit in this for it to work. A lot. Even the northern owners of the citrus companies that know that this convict lease system is what's keeping those oranges picked every day. So there's a lot of people involved.
It's not just keeping the orange picked, it's keeping the orange picked at a cheap price. Right. I mean, that's why they don't even want to pay fair labor in a desperately poor county when labor's cheap. It's got to be cheaper. They got to have the sheriff go out and enslave people, essentially, in peonage. And by the way, even today, you look at, we don't focus on the book because it's on that part of the book, even though thank you for putting it in there, because it's so much more dramatic what happened to these 4 kids, really. But sometimes that's the more devastating story. You look at Ferguson and you can focus on that one event, but the Attorney General report talks about a whole system of basically extorting money from minorities to fund the city government. So thank you for putting that in there. But so you've got them benefiting, the owners of the citrus grove. Then you've got the mob mentality, right? And the culture that hates authority and believes in mob justice. So I take your point, but I still am scared of Sheriff McCall. I mean, do you remember what Williams said, Gilbert? Can you remember? He said something. He was in Gainesville, back in Florida. He found out McCall was still alive, and he got afraid.
And that was in the 1980s. He goes back and does this oral history with the University of Florida, and they ask him about Willis McCall, and he says, "Is he around here? I have no doubts he will try and kill me if he knows I'm around here." And but I got to echo what Paul said, because it was a really important point. McCall could not have accomplished what he accomplished at every stage, every level. Somebody had his back, whether it was the judge, whether it was the prosecutor, whether it was the governor. I mean, he had stuff on the governor, and the U.S. attorney in Tampa, another one who's like not motivated by these civil rights. They all were covering for him. So it's a sociological story. It's a story about a system, not really about one man. And I thought about like the title Devil in the Grove, and sometimes you think, well, McCall's got to be the devil, but I always saw the devil as the system. This could have been anybody. As long as you're in the system, you're going to have these kind of actors who are capable of these kind. And if it's not McCall, it could be somebody else who is capable of maybe not the same level of violence, but the same kind of oppression.
Yeah, you did a great job of that. I think so. I never took Devil in the Grove to be McCall. I saw an interview of you where you had meant it more generally. I mean, it was us, really. I mean, right? I mean, Floridians, it was us. So a couple more comments. What do you guys think about Norma Paget in this sense? She was 17. She apparently was being beat by her husband. She was hungry, and not to say it's an excuse, but you've got these 2 World War II veterans, right? They don't put up with anything, as they shouldn't, on the side of the road when apparently he started talking to them like and he was young too. I think he was younger than Irvin and than the two of them. But and so they hit him and they knocked him down. But then if Willie Paget concocted the story, a 17-year-old girl who gets beaten by her husband, it seems possible that she would go along with it even if she didn't think of it.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to make. And by the way, Norma Paget is still alive.
I didn't know
that's one of the things. I recently, like the year before, just within the last 2 years, the state of Florida officially pardoned the Groveland boys. It was done by the parole commission, and Norma Paget actually showed up in a wheelchair to testify that she was against the pardons. And I had tried to speak to her, before when I was trying to write the book, and it was, it was one of those things I really regret that she didn't speak to me. She just decided, she said, let sleeping dogs lie. She didn't want to revisit it. She hadn't talked to anybody in like 60 something years since the case came out. And I think she was warned to keep her mouth shut, because if she said something wrong, she could be prosecuted. And she started to give an interview to a Tampa Bay Times or St. Pete Times reporter, and she said some things that conflicted with her testimony, and he kind of wrote about that, and it got her a lot of attention. And I think she was paid a visit from either the sheriff or the prosecutor and told to not talk to anybody, which she didn't. But I think that was a really good point that you made, because I don't believe that this has always been her story. I think this story was forced on her by the men in her life, whether it was Willie, her father, who was in the Klan, whether it was the prosecutor or the sheriff. They sort of needed her to say her part and do her part, but they took the story from her. They acted on this story. They went out and, killed the defendants. They went and burned down the homes. Like, this was part of a concerted effort of like enforcing and keeping their, heels on the throat of the African-American community. And by enforcing that, so it was really never Norma's story. I always believed it was a story put in place that they knew they could do some general housekeeping in Lake County, get rid of those guys who were wearing their military uniforms after the war, get rid of those guys who were involved in Bolita and maybe not making payoffs to the sheriff. Those are the things, economic reasons. Like, it's very, usually in these kind of cases where the threat of sexual assault is made, it's very rarely true, because it was the most dangerous thing you could do as an African American was to be caught, as Emmett Till could tell you, just even whistling or something, or making a comment, to being accused of this. Oftentimes you didn't have time to defend yourself. They ran you out of town. They burned your houses down. They maybe even lynched you. And so it was extraordinarily a dangerous thing to do. And to be accused of something like this, there's no doubt why Ernest Thomas fled. He knew it was happening. He knew they were burning down black homes. He knew they were arresting the Groveland boys and taking them under the basement and beating them. And so, he did what was smart. He got out of town. And so that was just apparent to me. It was never really about these sexual assault charges.
All right. Let me ask you, you brought up a little bit, we were talking about Thurgood Marshall and his effect on other people. It's dangerous to put a halo over one particular individual, but, I really got the sense, not just from your book, that he was a rare and special human being. And so do you think it was him? Your book, I think you say it, some witnesses must have told you, or somebody must have said it, that it was Marshall who had a profound effect on Mabel Reese, and to a lesser extent, the prosecutor, Jesse Hunter. He wrote to the governor asking to commute the sentence, and Mabel Reese certainly did a complete about face. And it seems like they attribute that to meeting Thurgood Marshall. Can we give him credit for that? Because it's an amazing thing to change the heart of a human being.
Yeah, and honestly, I did not expect that. But then, I saw the letter and I read interviews with Mabel, and she said, Jesse Hunter was profoundly affected by that case. And one of the things that he said he was affected by was, and Marshall, at this time had been on the cover of Time magazine as Mr. Civil Rights. Everybody knew who he was. They knew that he was involved in these landmark civil rights cases. But I think the striking thing in this entire story was like Jesse Hunter's reaction. He said, Thurgood Marshall is one of the most genius lawyers in the country, and he's treating me with respect. And for some reason, like, think about it. he's saying that an African American is treating him, a lawyer, a state attorney, an elected state attorney, with respect. And he said one of the biggest regrets was that there were no desegregated restaurants that they could go out and have a cup of coffee in. And so he never got to have a conversation with Thurgood Marshall outside of the table in court. And you know, I think Marshall, there was a truth to that. Marshall always treated people a certain way. He wasn't bitter. He was trying to find a way that everybody could agree. And if you believed in equality and you believed in the Constitution, you have to believe certain truths. And I think Marshall used that. And I think it was why he was so effective before the Supreme Court, winning these 9-0 decisions. Can you imagine that happening today, 9-0 decision? I mean, in a race case in the 1950s, doesn't make any sense. And he did win those kind of cases. And I think he chose to argue for the betterment of America and not to beat people over the head. And his tact was very successful. And I think I learned a lot from him by presenting an argument in a book. Like, just speak the truth, because the truth is really on your side. Marshall had the truth on his side in this case. He didn't need to dramatize. He didn't need to exaggerate. He just needed to tell the truth. And I think that was one of the things that he did in these cases that really made an impact on me. The other thing I think is just Marshall understanding that, yeah, I could lose these cases. I often do, but people are traveling from miles and miles around to sit in those Jim Crow balconies and get a glimpse of what the future might possibly look like, getting a glimpse of hope, seeing an African-American standing in court and arguing law. It was inspirational. People took their children to see this. And I've met people, elderly African-American lawyers who told me that they showed up in the South and sat in the Jim Crow argument balcony to see Thurgood Marshall argue cases, and what an impact that had on their own lives. And they became lawyers because of it. So, it wasn't, Marshall's accomplishments were not all through the courts. A lot of what he was doing was affecting hearts and minds. And in those courtrooms was his chance to be Mr. Civil Rights and to give people a glimpse of hope for the future.
And John, to get on that point too, if you think about Fort Lauderdale, one of our legal giants, our civil rights giants, Raleigh Walls, he was the first Black man to open a practice here in Broward County. And he went to Howard University during the time that Thurgood Marshall and members of the Legal Defense Fund were actually working for their oral arguments leading up to Brown versus the Board of Education. And he would tell me and many members of the TJ Rabbit Bar Association, in between classes and in between lunches at Howard University, he'd go to the oral argument room and watch him practice his oral arguments. And he talked about how that had a profound effect on him and how giant of a man he was. On a lighter note, Langston Hughes is one of my most favorite poets. I've read everything written by Langston Hughes, and he actually went to college with Thurgood Marshall. And when he was once asked, hey, tell us about this Thurgood Marshall guy. And his comment was, he was rough and ready and loud and wrong.
Wait, loud and what?
Loud and wrong. He was, and when you read accounts, he was just that personality. He was that. He was a charismatic guy, but also it goes to his background, his upbringing, and he wanted to go to the University of Maryland Law School. They wouldn't let him in due to segregation, and so he fought that to try to do that, and it didn't happen. So he ended up going to Howard University School of Law. That ended up being probably one of the more, I think, the more influential moments not only in his life but in American history, because he came in contact with Charles Hamilton Houston, who developed the legal tactics and arguments, this crazy concept of the 14th Amendment, and applying those concepts of equal protection and fighting against segregation. And so I think his life and experiences and moments in his life played such a crucial role to us getting to the moments that we've experienced in this country that we can look back on and say, he is probably the greatest American jurist I think of our time. I really truly believe that.
Yeah, my father, who did go to Howard also, and did go to those same oral argument practices, and knew Thurgood Marshall from Howard, and got a chance to work with him, got a chance to sit with him during the arguments on this case. It's funny though, the person he was most impressed with was Walter Irvin. when Walter Irvin was given a chance
Yeah.
to just to take a plea and refused because he just couldn't allow himself. Despite the urgings of Thurgood Marshall and my dad, and I mean, he tells the story. Well, Thurgood left the room and said, "Paul, you talk to him," and they, and just wouldn't do it. Would rather die than take a plea. That just tells you the measure of that man. And, that was the person he was most impressed with through this whole thing, even though he worked alongside, I think, the giant in American jurisprudence. The only Supreme Court justice that was a real lawyer,
Trial lawyer, appellate lawyer,
real
lawyer.
trial lawyer, not the Harvard, then clerked for a judge, and then got it, then went, not that whole thing, but a lawyer's lawyer, then became, Solicitor General for the United States, and then U.S. Supreme Court Justice. Who else really had that background?
We don't pick our Supreme Court justices that way anymore. They seem to be political operatives, not real lawyers who accomplish so much. Let me just ask you, because it's a perfect fitting, if anyone has any comment on this, and maybe you don't, but in the book, you quote Thurgood Marshall. He says something that his dad told him, and I recognize that quote because I saw him say it on TV right after he retired when they asked him what he thought of his potential replacement. And he said his dad told him there's no difference between a white snake and a black snake. They'll both bite. So, I think we got bit. Without getting too many particulars on who's on the court right now, could Thurgood Marshall do what he did? We're not as evil as back then, and yet at the same time, I feel the court is so narrowly. It looks at things so narrowly that it wouldn't do justice in the way that old court did. So I don't know. Anybody want to comment on that? Who doesn't have any cases in front of the Supreme Court right now?
Here's what I'd say about federal court in general, right? As a practitioner here in Central Florida. Back then, federal court was the place where the downtrodden went for justice when state and local governments were treating us like dogs. And now it is the chosen venue of the rich and powerful.
Yeah.
Whenever you got a case that, those of you who do civil work, when you got a case, if they can get it into federal court, that's where they want it, right? Now so that's exactly the opposite of where we were 50 years ago. Is that improvement or is it worse?
It's worse. The courts are supposed to be the way you can vindicate individual right. It's like you said in the book, Thurgood Marshall would go down there knowing his only sword was a piece of paper called the United States Constitution, right? Because the Constitution, a flawed document, gave certain individual rights, but now in various ways, the federal courts have found ways not to enforce individual rights. Corporate rights, the 14th Amendment says all persons shall not be deprived of due process of law, but somehow that has become that corporations have these rights at our expense. All right, I'm sorry, I'm going off on it, but I agree with you, Paul. Maybe we could have a drink sometime and talk about that. Let me remind everyone, we've got these great literary prizes. I don't know, maybe everyone has already done it. We've got these great books and a little portable bar. So click on the link if you want to be in the giveaway for that. But so let me turn now. We try to really finish this within an hour and a half. But I want to talk about one more thing before we do the drawing. And it has to do with that quote about the he would get on the train, would go down in the South at great personal danger, and he knew that that his only sword was a piece of paper called the United States Constitution. Well, on the bicentennial of the Constitution, Thurgood Marshall gave a speech. And so I just want to give you a couple of very short excerpts from that speech. The government the founders devised was defective from the start. And remember, this is the sword he carried into the South. The government our founders devised was defective from the start, requiring several amendments, a civil war, and momentous social transformation to attain the system of constitutional government in its respect for the individual freedoms and human rights we hold as fundamental today. When contemporary Americans cite the Constitution, they invoke a concept that is vastly different from what the framers barely began to construct 2 centuries ago. And so we must be careful when focusing on the events which took place in Philadelphia 2 centuries ago, that we not overlook the momentous events which followed, the suffering, struggle, and sacrifice, Paul, that your father was involved in, that Thurgood was involved in, and thereby lose our proper sense of perspective. If we seek instead a sensitive understanding of the Constitution's inherent defects and its promising evolution through 200 years of history, the celebration of the miracle at Philadelphia will, in my view, be a far more meaningful and humbling experience. We will see that the true miracle was not the birth of the Constitution, but its life, a life nurtured through 2 turbulent centuries with struggle and sacrifice. That always gives me chills to think about that, what he was saying, right? Because it's a living document, it has life, that's its genius. And then there were true heroes that came along, like Paul's dad, and made that into the miracle, the document, the constitutional republic that we now have, and maybe are losing a little bit in modern life. So I don't know. Anybody want to comment on that, Harold or Paul or Gilbert, on how I think Marshall was saying there? The founders are not the true architects of our current freedoms.
That's a great, John, that's a great point. And like one of the things I remember when I was watching the confirmation of Elena Kagan to the Supreme Court, Elena Kagan had clerked to Thurgood Marshall. And at one point during a confirmation, she was going through some really contentious questioning, and they said, your mentor, the man you served as clerk for on the Supreme Court, called the US Constitution defective. And she had to answer that. And it was set up as like, you mean the most perfect document in the history of America is seen as defective? And I think that was part of her ability to answer that was her exposure to Thurgood Marshall. And she basically said it was defective. It's a living, breathing document. It needed to be improved. Anytime that you claim to have equality for all people, and yet African Americans are given 3/5 personhood, that's not a document that we should be proud of without having fixed it. And so I think that she was able to parry that line of questioning, but that's where it was. I thought it was a really cynical form of questioning in the Supreme Court. So that was a really, I love that speech that he made. And I always ask people, like, when I do these talks, how many people here have ever seen Thurgood Marshall speak? And it's really only a few hands. It's like we see Martin Luther King speaking. We have these newsreel footage of these kind of events, but nobody really has seen Thurgood Marshall speak unless you see like his announcement of his retirement, or maybe some old newsreel footage after Brown versus Board. But he's ultimately not very people. And the tragedy of that is you didn't really understand what a great and powerful orator he was until you really see him speak in public. You can see the personality and the devilish smile, the jokes that come up with him. Like you can really feel the force of his personality. There's a great clip, you can find it on YouTube. Mike Wallace does an interview with him in 1956. And it's like a broken up interview, but maybe 7 minutes long. But you watch that and you can tell why people said, when he walked into a room, he dominated it, and you could sort of feel it.
All right. Well, listen, thank you, Paul, Harold, Gilbert. Jim had to go a little early. I think Roland's going to take over and tell us who won the prizes. But really, Gilbert, thank you for writing this book. Paul, I see how great a lawyer you are. I hope you don't get offended that we talk so much about your dad. but he was a true American hero. And
Thank you for saying that very much.
yeah, absolutely. And Harold, as usual, thanks for doing always the right thing. All right, thanks, guys. Roland, go ahead, take that over.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen with you and we'll spin the wheel for the prizes. Here we go. The first prize, I think, is a set of books. Amy Schill, congratulations.
All right, so Amy, we'll get those to you. It's those 3 books on making literary themed drinks.
All right, now we're going to go.
Oh, don't laugh at us. We'll send you those books too. I know you like a good drink. Second thing is really cool. It's a little bar in a box. All right, so hopefully we ended on a little bit of a, so many people who attended tonight had emailed me and said that this book was a tough read, and but it's true, and we have to face it. And so I'm glad you guys read it and then showed up, and I can't thank Gilbert enough for writing it. So anyway, and then Paul, hopefully I can have a drink with you. We'll talk about the federal courts sometime. And Harold, I'll see you soon.
Absolutely. Nice meeting you, Harold. You
Pleasure
too.
meeting you.
Look forward to seeing you guys in person.
All right.
Thank you,
Take care,
guys.
John.
All right, see you.
All right.